That's one thing. I have, this one gets
you have a
clogged
problem?
too.
Yeah.
And I have this Chinese tool that I can put in and clean out some of that chlorine. It's shaped like, it's got a long handle like this. And at the end, this is metal, and then it has a little metal hoop at the end. Yeah, it takes.
Yeah, I don't have a wax problem.
Okay. I have a new dog. I have a new dog.
Oh, wow.
Her dog is adorable.
Wow. What kind is it?
This little tiny thing.
It's got a lot of corgi in it.
Does it?
But it's corgi and something.
I mean, is this in, because you're trying to be coronation oriented in there?
I can't stand all that kind of stuff.
Because the Queen's dogs are corgis, right?
All right, welcome to the Charter Commission meeting May 10th, 2023. Dick, I see you online on Zoom. You want to give us a mic check?
How do I do that? Just say hello?
You just did. Great job. Well done.
That's
Oh.
about the limit of my technology.
How are you feeling, Dick?
Well, I just had an hour and a half of physical therapy, so I'm in a little pain, but other than that, I'm good.
Good to hear it. All right, we'll get started like we always do with roll call.
Okay, Ted.
Here.
Chris Babbage.
Present.
Janice Vance is here. Brenda Robinson.
Brenda Robinson.
Durwood.
Here.
Susan.
Present.
Christian.
Here.
Stephen.
Present.
And we also have Merton Brown, our town clerk, and Nellie Burns, our town attorney. And we have Richard Smith.
You can call
via
for him.
Zoom. Yeah.
I think I already said hello.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. No, I don't think we can. I think that's as loud as the volume goes, unfortunately. Oh, maybe it goes louder. I think it's coming from the TV. Mike's gonna come yell at me. All right, welcome everyone. I'd like to point out before we get started, first agenda that I fit on one page, so big accomplishment. We'll start out after roll call here with public comment. Section for the public to comment. Anyone from the public who wants to comment? Nope. Seeing no attendees online, we'll move on to old business. So last time we reviewed the recall second draft and had discussion about that. Any comments, concerns, considerations from anyone before we move on from that topic? Old business? Natalie, yes.
I know I missed the last meeting.
Just,
Sorry.
yep, hit your mic.
Yeah, I've already forgotten about the mics.
Yeah.
At the last meeting, I know you reviewed this. The one portion of it that I had any concern about on the recall was the portion that allows a person to be suspended from their position pending the recall. I have not seen that in other charters. I think there might be one that has it. And I think there could be some concern that suspending somebody without the voters having weighed in on whether they're actually going to be recalled is something that could be subject to challenge. If the commission wants to keep it in, that's fine. I just did want to express that I had a concern about that.
Noted. Martin?
Yeah, and the other issue with that too is that it really could take, 2 or 3 months, depending on when the recall would happen. for representation. There would be no representation on the board.
Okay, so that's in reference I see it, Gail. That's in reference to the idea that once a recall moves forward for an elected position, they then they get suspended from that position prior to the actual recall vote. Correct? Yeah. Just for clarification.
I'm not sure how I speak, do I just say hello?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah, I had the same misgivings on that. And also, whatever happened to the presumption of innocence in any kind of case in this country? Just because somebody's been indicted or put under a microscope doesn't mean that they're guilty. And it just seems that that's not the appropriate way to handle that.
Noted. Gail, did you want to say something? Go ahead. Yep.
Gail Spofford, Kennybunk. In the one and only recall election we've had for the school board, there was only one candidate that ran against the recall, and the recall petitioners did not run a candidate. So you actually run the risk of having no one running against the recall, so you're unrepresented, as Merton and Natalie referenced. And on the school board, if that were to happen, we have weighted votes, and we would be underrepresented on the school board by a significant number of votes. And although we don't really pull that string, everybody understands that every time we vote, it's the weighted average. So the town of Kennybunk could be significantly underrepresented. And I wouldn't ask anyone who is simply being recalled to step down from serving until they had actually, the recall effort had prevailed. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Susan?
I had a couple comments about Nathan Poor's presentation, and
Okay.
I don't know where that's going to appear.
Yeah, that's a good call out that I didn't include in all business. Would you mind if we do that after because I think Durwood, did you have something about the recall? And yep,
Right.
go ahead.
And I had comments on section 4 and 5.
Of the
Of
second
the-
draft.
Recall language. When will we address that?
Probably not tonight. Maybe a stretch goal. Do you want to speak to them as part of like old business here, or should we? Because we will be going over in the future the full recall article, but tonight's new business focus was talking about forfeiture of office, in hope that it kind of clarifies, things that are automatic, like loss of office, so that we kind of clear the space for what recall actually is targeting. And then talking about section 702, which is recall, reasons for recall. And then 7.03, there was some discussion last time about how we present the actual recall paperwork, if you will, so that,
Okay.
sorry if I've muddied the water with that. But.
No, well, what it does have to, some of the sections have changed.
Yes.
And my issue is, I had comments from the meeting 2 weeks ago, and I don't want them to get buried and forgotten because we're moving forward. So however you want to handle that, but one of them anyway does have to do with the paperwork.
Okay.
So at your
Yeah.
leisure.
If it's 704 and 703 or other ones we're not discussing, I'd say hold them. Let's talk. We will discuss the rest of the recall provision in the future, but if that's okay.
Yeah, I don't want things to become irrelevant in the revision, the continued revisions of these drafts. Because something I thought became irrelevant, one of my comments because of a revision, but I see actually by seeing these new copies that it isn't
Okay,
irrelevant.
okay.
So it's just, we're going over a lot of things, and I don't know what to do about, comments from previous meetings. We're, moving ahead is important, but having things up in the air yet from the past is going to become confusing. So however you want to
Yeah.
handle that as chair is
Yep.
fine.
I would say we'll handle them in the future. So if they're about 704, 705, 706, we'll definitely be going through those sections again in the future. And if they're still applicable in the future, we'll talk through them then,
Okay,
if that's okay.
whatever you say.
All right. Durwood?
Hi, I just had a follow-up question about the suspension question comment language. I recall a difficult situation involving a select board member many years ago, and there was the question of what to do in the sort of in-between time. And I think the advice from the town attorney was that you can ask that member to step aside from committee assignments. And that seemed to be a pretty powerful step. I mean, if you're not on any committees, I assume that person could still show up at the board meetings and vote. But is that, I guess that's a question for Natalie, is that a thing that is in the statute or case law, or just kind of a ad hoc type of concept?
It is something that I've seen done.
Mike, Natalie, sorry.
I have two places that have the same microphone, and in one place you have to press it, and the other one you don't. So it is not something that's in the statute. It is something that I think elected officials or planning boards or whatever have done as a matter of process, but it's not something that's supported. Just as in the past, I certainly have seen in municipalities a select board request that a member step aside when there's not a recall provision because of conduct. But it's not something that is required, and so
I
therefore they wouldn't
suppose
have to.
a follow-up question, if I could. I suppose it'd be possible to write in there that an option instead of suspension would be asking the elected officer to step aside from committee assignments. I'm not saying I'm advocating it, but would that be a good thing if the board agreed, this commission agreed to write in rather than have it sort of an informal concept?
You could do something like that, certainly. The only thing I was concerned about is removing the ability of the person to vote on things during that pendency of time while they're subject to recall. And also, I think there would be a concern that it may be that the rest say that it's the select board. It might be that the select board doesn't like this person, which happened in another town I represent, and they were the ones who actually filed the petition to recall the person, and then they're making a determination whether that person can sit during that period of time, which feels uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I'll echo again what Dick said, and that, there is the threat of this being used as a weapon, right? And even committee removal is not innocent until proven guilty, right? It's sure, that's more minor than saying step aside from the select board in your example or whatever, but,
Just the challenge on the, I think the suspension is murky and probably not a good way to go. But, I mean, people are suspended in work life all the time without, being found, guilty of anything. It's just why it's prudent you're suspended without pay. And it's not as if there's a property right in being on the Board of Selectmen that's being denied by asking them to step aside. That doesn't mean I would favor it. I think the cons outweigh the pros. But
I think there's a definitive line between, private enterprise and public office that is a liable risk for an enterprise, or a private company, whereas they have that leeway where a public official might not. I've got Gail, then I've got Chris, and then I've got Brenda. Gail, go ahead.
Gail Spofford. MSMA, Maine School Management Association, does have policy on the books, and I apologize. I can't get on my computer from here, so it's part of the B series, but I don't recall now. It's only 4 letters, and I think it's BBBD. The title is Removal of Officers and Board Members from Committees. RSU 21 does not have that on the books. We are going to discuss it. I believe it's not there for a reason. It's a double-edged sword. But we are going to discuss it. I don't remember it ever being part of SAD 71, but we just thought it was worth discussing. But I think Derwit's right, or the other people also have said, without due process, you're also removing someone from a committee, and that could destroy quorum if you have a vote. So there are those considerations. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. Chris Babbage?
Thanks. Yes, I appreciate Dick bringing this up. The suspension also concerned me, and I also thought about it being weaponized, which you mentioned, Mr. Chair. I wonder what Derwood brought up is interesting. I mean, we're not in a court of law, so we do have the right to put it in the charter. I'm not sure about the wisdom to. What Derwood brought up, I'm wondering if the committee assignments are discretionary, usually appointed by the chair of the select board. I don't know, with the approval of the select board, is that how it's done? I mean, I know that in legislative situations, the presiding officer of the branches assign, and they unassign. I know of a disagreement that happened one time where the fellow went to work the next day and found his name had been taken off the door of his of the committee that he thought he was the chair of. But that kind of discretion is not what I'm talking about. But I still think it's discretionary to a greater degree than actual service. So
Yeah.
I do understand that. And evidently, that must now be possible if in fact it's been in our past practice.
And I believe you're correct. I believe the workings are is it's generally more like a volunteer basis, like, hey, I'm a recently elected select board member and I'm interested in serving on these committees, and then the chair appoints with the volunteer. I don't think it's quite as formal as being like, well, Susan, I'm going to appoint you to this committee, and who cares if what your opinion is. I think it is kind of volunteer thing as I understand it, but it is an appoint. Brenda, and then Ted.
It seems to me that suspension and committee appointments should be in the same bag. If you keep someone on if they are not suspended from the committee, from the group, but they are relieved of committee assignments, you're saying, well, you're guilty on this side, but you're not on this side.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't make sense to me. If you're okay to remain on whatever group it is, then you should be okay to remain on the committees. It just, I can hear somebody standing up at a meeting asking why, and we'd have a hard time justifying that.
Yep. Fair point. Ted?
Yeah, I'd have a hard time legislating an automatic suspension in a charter. There have to be a really good reason to be guilty until proven innocent in our country. But beyond that, listening to the conversation, there's a lot of ways to deal with, hey, we got a sensitive issue and one of our numbers being recalled. What can we do about that? And one of the suspension from this, that, or there's many ways it can be done. And it seems that it's not the role to try to put all that into a charter.
Yeah.
So I don't think that discussion, that part belongs in the charter at all. But there's plenty of ways of dealing with
Yeah. Thanks, Ted.
preemptive discipline if need be.
Thank you. I've got Stephen, and then I see you, Dick. You want Dick to go first. All right, Dick, go for it.
I've heard a lot of people talk around how we could discipline people during that time period, but I really haven't heard anybody say it's a good idea. In fact, I haven't heard anybody at all say that it's a good idea to do it. And even Durwood, who came the closest by saying the negatives outweigh the positive, it seems to me that we all ought to, that everybody is agreeing that this is not a good idea to put any such restrictions in it. And perhaps we're spending too much time trying to figure out the nitty-gritty when I think we all, from what I've heard, all agree that it's just not a good idea at all.
Yep. Stephen?
As you can tell from the discussion tonight, it's an issue where there are good arguments on both sides. The reason that, I mean, we put the prefatory language in here, saying you can go one way or the other. And based upon the comments that we heard during the last hearing, we had originally proposed no automatic suspension, followed by potential hearing and a suspension following that. And now I'm hearing exactly the reverse of that. So that just sort of, it's not intended as a criticism of anybody. It's just to show how finely balanced that particular issue is. And we've got to make a collective decision as to how to approach that. If the collective decision is that due process considerations have to be given primacy here, and there should be no automatic suspension of the right to participate as a voting member, it's easy to draft that language, and we can certainly do that. And if I or we were mistaken in hearing what I thought we heard last time, then I apologize, but it's a relatively simple matter to go back and draft up proper language to effectuate that objective. Personally, I think that the due process considerations must be given primacy. That's a wrong move, I think, to start out with a presumption of guilt as opposed to innocence. And I can certainly understand that there would be arguments on the other side. For example, if someone had been accused of improprieties, just as an example, do you want that person continuing to participate in the yes/no process? But you have to put your you pinch your nose and put aside your distaste at that idea, and you've got to put the presumption of innocence first, in my view. That's just my personal perspective. But I do emphasize it's fairly easy to flip that in drafting up the language, and we can certainly do that in the next draft.
Thanks, Stephen. Chris Babbage, then Brenda.
Just a quick comment. I think all of us came here knowing there were 2 or 3 major issues for us to deal with as a charter commission. But I think a lot of us really asked the question, are recalls necessary at all? So the alternative being no recall procedure, I think us putting in a recall procedure that still protects due process is in order. I mean, it's not such a big step when you think that there might not even be the opportunity for recall in many, many communities, and we were considering that ourselves.
Brenda?
I'm trying to put a face and a name with something. I like the term prescriptive discipline. I really like that. And I think there are ways to deal with someone who has done something that would force a recall vote. And I want to put a name with a substantial, well, maybe this gets into forfeiture, but the same issue. If Elliot Cutler were on this board, what would we do? Before he was charged and then taken to court and found guilty, if we don't suspend and we keep on committees, that is due process. But I think the preemptive discipline also goes to the way Arundel handled their school board member who had really upset people in town, and there didn't have to be a recall because the preemptive discipline talk, which was done in executive session, resulted in what people in the town were really supporting. So when you make it real as opposed to abstract, those are the things that we have to deal with. And I just want to throw that out. I would not suspend. I would ask whoever's in charge to perhaps go into executive session and deal with it that way. But I don't think that we remove due process.
Ed?
Yeah, these are real issues and things that happen, Brenda, but I'm wondering if this is something that the charter can legislate on. I just am saying it doesn't belong in the charter. It belongs somewhere, and that there's plenty of experience that administrative bodies have on these issues. And so I'm just saying, yes, this is all real, it's important, but I don't think so in the charter. Yeah.
All right. Yep, go ahead, Durward.
I mean, if not in the charter, where? I mean, if something extreme comes along, what do you rely on for the road, to decide the road forward? I mean, where do you go? We just can't have
Depends on the legislative body. So the select board might have something, the school board might have something. They have their own ways of working these things. And so, and they would do that. That's my concern. It's hard for us to put in a charter, as we've been struggling with recall, or grounds for recall. It's hard to put in all the possibilities. Once you start, you got to put in all the possibilities, or make a general statement like, okay, the appropriate bodies may or may not suspend, or something like that. I'm just saying, to try to put all the necessary, sufficient conditions for suspension into a charter would be well beyond what we should be doing, and that that's all I'm saying.
All right, Gail and Susan, and I'm gonna try to wrap this old business conversation up before we get too far down the rabbit hole.
Gail Spofford, it's interesting, Brenda, that you brought that up, because I was just whispering to Miriam that if Elliot Cutler had been on our board, he wouldn't have been on our board anymore. Because we deal directly with children, and it couldn't possibly happen. And I think, without divulging any information about executive session, that we could make it happen in executive session. So, but I do have a question, if I may. So, are you looking at the charter as a policy document or a process document? Because I think there's a difference.
I think you're right. It definitely, and I would answer right off the cuff, and I say I think it's both, because we need.
I mean, it is possible that it's both, but I think the issue that you're dealing with right now could potentially, if you wanted to, and maybe it's not this body, could be addressed through policy, and the town does have policy. So you could potentially do it that way. You could reference it in this document, but not detail it in this document, perhaps. Thank you.
Thanks. Susan?
To Ted's point, the sufficient conditions, you mentioned the select board and the school board, but there are boards and committees in town, and if the charter is the town's constitution, I think this language has to be in there. I mean, this is the guiding document for the town, and it is process. So I think it is not inappropriate to have this as part of the charter.
So this language is what I'm getting at. What is the this? Do we lay out all the necessary and sufficient conditions in the charter, or do we have a clause that says that this may or may not happen, and leave it to the body to develop a policy to do it the way they're going to do it? I mean, it's a question of It is a process question.
I think we should deliberate on that. I think it's our responsibility to deal with these issues now. I don't know what exactly, what they're going to look like, say, 6 months from now. But I think it's important to give all of this oxygen and discuss it and get public input and see how it falls out. But I think shying away from it may not be the proper thing to do.
Small correction, Susan. I'm
at
not
this
trying
point.
to shut it down. I'm just giving an opinion about what should be in here and that we're all deliberating and we want to fully deliberate the issue. I'm all for that.
Right. So I feel that it is appropriate to have it in the document.
All right. I'm going to give the last comment on this to Merton.
Just two
And then
things
we're
I
gonna
would
move
say.
on.
First of all, the recall is for elected officials only, first thing. Second thing, remember, at the very start of this process, the person who even rumored that they're going to be recalled has the option to resign.
Okay, cool. Good thing to simmer on and ruminate on for the next 2 weeks until we meet back to discuss it. So, or discuss more fun. So let's move on. Susan, you wanted to make a comment about what Nathan Poor discussed last week.
I just had two comments. One was just to mention, put a point on this for us and the public, that Mr. Poor's presentation was one person's opinion on how that model, which was the town manager and the town council, functioned, and in that particular town, in Falmouth, and not to give it any more weight than it deserves, and just to make the comment that there are other models and other people who could make testimonials for them. And then the other comment I had was, looking back on my notes, Mr. Poor had said that he felt having a town council form of government, and I think this was a quote, was a plus in attracting and keeping town employees. And I wondered if anybody recalled why that was, or if he detailed that in any way. I was wondering why it was a plus in attracting and keeping town employees as opposed to another model. Does anybody recall that?
I don't think he delved into why. If I recall it, I'd have to go back and watch the recording. So, go ahead, Janice.
Well, I remember him making a comment because I recorded it in minutes, and I admit I wondered, and we probably should have stopped him at that point and asked why his opinion was that.
I think
And I've never been a person, looking for a job at a municipality, but I wonder what the evaluation criteria would be. Would the form of government, if you were looking for a position in a town, make a difference in your decision to apply for a job? I don't know.
Go ahead, Derek.
I think that you were hearing from perhaps one of the most experienced and competent town managers besides our own in the state there, and has been through every conceivable battle. And what he was saying is that choosing between the models, it's so much easier to rely on a council that hopefully you establish relationships and working relationships, and a council with power, as opposed to being at the whim of a town meeting and all of the build-up for the town meeting and all the crazy things that can happen in a town meeting. And of course, as we know, at town meetings, very few people attend, and sometimes it can be swayed by a very small group. I think he was saying that when a town reaches a certain size, it's a more like professional way to run the town rather than the old town meeting style. It's sort of like an evolution in the town's journey. And so what keeps the manager in is consistency and not a bumpy road as bumpy a road. And I think that's what he was basically begging us to understand was that, what a difference it makes.
Gotcha. You
Can
go-
we ask him?
Yeah, I'm sure we could reach out via email and ask, I'm sure. And I'll take that as an action item. So. All right. Any other comments? Any comments about action items before we move on? Last week. Okay. Let's move on to new business. So first up, we had decided last meeting that we were going to start out this meeting by discussing the proposed forfeiture of office language, which is provided up on the document buffet up there. And Janice and Stephen have worked very hard on putting this together again, along with the recall draft. So does anyone want to take it away with comments? Or Janice and Stephen, would you like to lead in with? Go ahead, Stephen.
The draft that you have before you should be viewed as absolutely just a first sketch of an outline for forfeiture. As we were looking at Article 702, the grounds for a recall, we encountered quite a lot of difficulty in trying to define exactly what those grounds would be, because as Ted observed, this can be largely a political process, and it's hard to craft a ground for recall that would be essentially political in nature. And I'm also very mindful of the input of Chris Babbage, and the actual draft that we prepared was more general in nature. I really liked the idea that he came up with, and we shamelessly plagiarized that. It's basically dishonesty or misconduct that rises to such a level that it amounts to a breach of the public trust. That's a perfect general statement. Yes, it's amorphous, but it emphasizes the seriousness of the misconduct that's necessary to take the very grave step of an electoral recall. Going back to looking at the specific grounds for removal from office, it's perfectly apparent to us that forfeiture and recall are like blood brothers. You've really got to provide specific grounds for forfeiture, and that's a fairly easy list to prepare. There are many sources that you can use to ascertain what individual grounds of forfeiture there should be. But the principal difficulty to my mind is what kind of process should there be for the serious step of actually holding someone accountable to forfeit their electoral or appointed office. And I'm not sure that the current version of the forfeiture provision really goes into the process that much. But one question that I would have actually for the town attorney, if I may, anytime you're dealing with a process, you've got to look at the various levels of review and appeal and so forth. And in my view, we don't want to have a de novo system of review for a reviewing body. If it's a superior court, for example, you don't want a judge basically supplanting the wisdom of a collective body such as a school board or a select board. And so I would think if it's permissible under Maine state law, and I'm confessedly no expert on that subject at all, but typically in the jurisdictions with which I'm familiar, you try to put a system of review in that is fairly narrow from the appellate perspective. And so you'd want a presumption of correctness on the part of the deliberative body, like the select board or the school board, but it could be overturned by a reviewing court under a standard of review that's very narrow. And the narrowest one I can think of is the decision of the collective body should be affirmed unless it's clearly erroneous or without evidence to support it. So the question for the town attorney is, can we prescribe a standard of review like that, or is there an automatic standard of review in appeals from decisions of municipal bodies that's contrary to that?
There is a standard of review for municipal decisions, and fortunately, as to factual findings, it is a deferential review. As to interpretations of law, which of course will include interpretations of the charter, it is not deferential. So if someone says, well, you couldn't do that under the provisions of the charter, the court's going to make that determination, and there's nothing you can put in here to say otherwise. As to the factual findings, though, that is the standard already, that it's deferential, and you don't need to put it in here. And also, if you put it in here, the court won't care what you say. They're going to use their own standard.
Right. Chris, Susan, I think I saw your hand first, and then I had Chris Babbage. You go ahead.
Are you going to comment about this? I was going to start.
Go ahead.
Do you want to do one section at a time?
I would like to go.
Yeah, go ahead and comment, and then we'll launch into it.
Thanks, yeah. I too wondered if we had the right to tell the court how to go about their decision-making, which I thought would be problematic. But, Stephen, I appreciate the nod. I saw some things in here that I liked very much, and you know, I'm scratching my head as we all approach this issue regarding the relationship between forfeiture and recall, because even the current wording for recall in the charter is fairly succinct. You know, I think it can be improved by a couple of things, but it seems to me that forfeiture is a far greater punishment than being subject to the scrutiny of a recall. Forfeiture is you're out regardless of what the people say. And so that's pretty important. And to me, that means ineligibility or a crime of a certain threshold. And I'm not sure how much to go beyond that, because all the other things that we detail are relevant, but I'm not sure they also take judgment. Judgment as to was you know, the public interest, the public trust, how do we gauge this? Is there a defense? And so, you know, I'm trying to, in my mind, wonder if there, I mean, I'm just throwing this out here because I'm not actually advocating it yet, but I was wondering if there is forfeiture, cut and dry, board-initiated recall, which takes some judgment, and then citizen-initiated recall, which can include what the board may neglect to do or have a little more flexibility, but with the difficult thresholds that we have done to make sure it's a minimum standard that has to be reached. But that, I'm just throwing that out there.
Thanks. All right, yeah. Let's start at the top. Vacancies and filling vacancies. Take it away, Susan.
Okay. In answer to the red line under number 2, discuss and reword to better explain what this means. What I was going to offer was discoveries of conflicts of interest, misrepresentation of qualifications, and deceptions.
Is that what it?
For, that would be failure.
Right.
Number
2.
What would be a failure to qualify for the office within 10 days after written demand by the select board?
I think that's the question. Well, what disqualifies you, right?
Right, what I just said, the
Yeah.
discoveries of conflict of things that were misrepresented or a deception of some sort.
I'm not advocating that deception isn't a disqualifier, but I don't know if that explicitly disqualifies you from taking office.
Right.
Merton, do you have any background as to
I
what?
can give you a good
number two
example.
might mean?
One year when nomination papers were due, I think we were electing 7 people, I think school board, it was back when we were electing the town clerk. Anyway, a person came in and took out papers for all positions that were open. And they can do that. And when that person brought them back to me 10 minutes before the deadline, he said, I want you to choose one of these for me. And I said, I like my job. I'm not doing that for you. And that person then did just choose one. But that person could have been on the ballot under every single office that was being elected. And then they would not qualify for, because a lot of those have a conflict. Like you
Okay,
can't be the-
So that will go right into the other thing I was going to mention, which is in the next paragraph, the properly qualified person. That term is vague, and I am going to ask my friend Miriam, who happens to be in the audience, wasn't qualifications a topic of conversation at a select board meeting fairly recently? I believe there was some discussion of what constitutes a qualified person. Maybe that was within a month or so. And so maybe this here is not the place to go into qualifications, but maybe that should be the problem of the select board to define.
Oh, I have it,
Mir-
but I left it at my seat.
Miriam, I can pinch hit if you're
Yeah,
not sure.
I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I'm wondering if it was, we've been having conversations recently about appointments to committees.
Exactly.
And we discussed people's qualifications.
Right.
But there was never any formal decision about what a qualification is. It was more of a general conversation about trying to develop a balance on a board of, let's say, business and non-business people, and in the case of, we've just been looking at the River Committee and looking for people who actually might use the river, or have, a connection to the river. I'm not sure I can remember anything else that might answer that question.
Yeah,
There
it's-
was certainly no formal outlines of anything like that.
Okay, but it was a topic of conversation. Just as an example, the fact that you live along the river might not necessarily make you a qualified person for that committee. But it was in the context of committees, and I just didn't know if, what I'm finding going through all of these documents, there's a charter, there's the committee handbook, there's,
Which I might add was written without any consultation with committee members or chairs.
yeah. There are a lot of town documents, and what I'm wondering was, as we go through, and I'll get to that later, as we go through this, as we're doing our work, it seems that there are other definitions and explanations in other documents that might have to be updated, so that we're all kind of dealing with the same, codes of conduct and ethics.
We have
and
consistency
whatever.
across
Right, right.
Yeah,
So,
I agree with you.
but anyway, thank you very much, because it seems, properly qualified person is another one of those vague
Vague.
terms. And I don't know if that was addressed and you answered this question, in any real form as it came up at that meeting.
No, it was just very specific to the that particular committee appointment.
Okay.
It occurred at the appointment meeting last June for committee members. I think it was brought to the floor by Courtney, and it kind of puts out this whole balance of, well, is putting out qualifications to participate in the public process restrictive of allowing people to participate in the public process? Is kind of yeah. So anyway, I've got Janice, I've got Ted, then I've got Brenda. Janice.
All right, I wanted to kind of maybe broaden this a bit. See, Stephen and I looked at this. This same language is used in a lot of towns, forfeiture language. And we sat kind of there and scratched our heads and say, what does this mean? And we played all kinds of scenarios out, and we didn't feel as though we got any closer to defining. To us, it sounded as though there would be something a member would have to do or be required to do, and if they didn't do it, the select board could basically say, you're out of here because you didn't do it. We couldn't figure out in any scenario of appointing someone to a board or someone being elected to a board what they could possibly demand. So, we wanted you guys to look at this because maybe it just makes sense. And maybe Natalie or somebody who's got some experience with other towns can see what this means. If we keep it, I'd like to better explain it, or otherwise delete it. We just didn't want to throw it out until we knew what it meant, basically.
Usually, it means that someone fails to take their oath within the required period of time. And the select board gives them additional time, says, come in, you've got to take your oath, because as you know, you all were sworn before you could begin your service. It's a requirement of state law, and so if you haven't been sworn, you're not a member of the select board. And if somebody refuses to come in and do it, and actually I have seen that happen as well, then that person is no longer qualified to be a member. I certainly understand that this language seems so broad, but that's the only context in which I've seen it. Maybe Durwood has seen it in other contexts.
Really briefly, I think you could just modify this and just say qualify under state law. I think it's not intended to open up a big Pandora's box. You're unqualified because you've got a bad personality or you have extreme views. It has to do with something specific, like you got to be old enough or have taken the oath, that type of thing. I think that the more discretionary ones come later in the forfeiture. So I wouldn't overthink that. I think I'd just say qualify under state law, and that would sweep in things like the oath.
Mm-hmm. Ted?
Yeah, you've helped make my point, Durwood. It's good to have these detailed documents, but working on it's like trying to eat an artichoke. You lift up one leaf and then there's some more underneath. And this is a good discussion for thinking through these issues. Qualification has a legal aspect, qualified or something under state law. And what the select board is working on, I like that discussion last night, it's sort of desirable attributes, which is I think that's more what I was hearing. Well, we want to have balance, and this one's got this attribute or interest. And that's different. I hear qualifications. I think, okay, that's somewhere written down. If we can define what all the qualifications are, God bless us. I can't see how we could possibly do that. But so to me, it's a mushy issue, and it might be simpler to see what Durwood said. Okay, qualifications under state law. Boom.
Next. All right. Like trying to eat an artichoke. I'm going to save that one for future use.
I like that.
Going to add it to my juice worth the squeeze. I've got Brenda next.
Durwood and Ted kind of pulled it together. When I read this, failure to qualify for the office within 10 days, well, how did somebody get in office without qualifying? And a written demand by the select board should already know what those qualifications are. I like what Durwood said according to state law, because it takes out all of the muddiness and, raises the question of how did you get into office if you weren't qualified?
The point is, Brenda, they can be elected without being qualified.
That's very true.
Right. And I mean, what I've certainly tried to do over the years is to say to somebody who wants to run for selectman and also run for, if the town clerk was elected, I go, well, those are incompatible offices and you can't do that. And they go, well, what happens if I win one and I don't, or I win both of those offices? Well, then you're going to have, you know, a situation where you're going to have another election.
My
to elect.
question is, what are the qualifications?
Yeah, could this just be solved by pointing to, like,
State
if it is
law.
state law,
Just
right?
state
And
law.
just say
Age.
reference.
Because if you haven't got qualifications written down for that particular office, and you haven't assured that there are qualifications, then it's mud season again.
All right, Stephen.
One example would be, this is a purely hypothetical example. What happens if you had the position of town medical officer? Someone wouldn't be properly qualified to fulfill that position unless they had a medical degree, presumably. That would be an example, the only kind of example that I could think of where you fail to qualify for the office because you don't have the qualifications for that office. With respect to the formula like prescribed by state law, I regard that as aspirationally excellent, but what happens if I would say, in my opinion, you don't qualify under state law, and the representative of the person would say, well, in my opinion, you do. So you've just got a general dispute about that. To my mind, if what Natalie said is true, that generally speaking, it means that you don't take the oath of office within the prescribed time period. Well, why don't we say that?
Yeah. Well,
Just say it, it's precise, it's clear, and it's not subject to ambiguity.
I think the frustration here is that when we say properly qualified in normal language, it's exactly to your example. Like, you are qualified for this job because you have a degree in medicine, so you get to be the town medical officer. But in this language, what qualified means is that you've completed the age requirement, the not running for multiple positions of the state that conflict with each other, residency, things like that. Those, and I think the qualification point in this is generally much more open than being so narrow as being you have to have this degree in medicine in order to qualify for this position. Sorry, I butted into
So do
conversation.
we keep it with amending to maybe add that with state, stuff in, or do you guys just want to like take it out and replace it with something else?
I think Durwood's suggestion of saying qualified as per state law makes sense if we can point to that part of state law, which I believe we can. I believe there's a section in state statute that says these are the qualifications for office, where it says you must be 18, you must be a resident, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to stop talking because Gail's up next, but go ahead. So I think, yes, that's my opinion. We can go around the room again and people feel free to voice their opinion. Go ahead, Gail.
Gail Spofford, I have a question. Does state law cover such things as licensing? So if you lost your license as a doctor, is that controlled by state law so that definition would still work?
No.
Or do you?
Actually, there is a local health officer, believe it or not, and there is a statute, and the person does not have to be a doctor. It can be the code enforcement officer.
Right.
They have to be certain qualification. Can be the town manager. Durwood knows because in a lot of towns there aren't doctors to serve. So while that's a great example in theory, it's not an actual requirement under state law.
Right. So I think to your question, Gail, is that the point I was trying to make is that qualifications in this sense are not that narrow. It's really much more broad, or because I think the spirit of the process is to make this publicly accessible. And, there's minimum bars. You can't be 9 and run for select board. You have to at least be of voting age, things like that. You have to be an, all right. All right.
No, and
Not going to touch that one.
I do think that that's probably the closest you're going to get.
Right.
I know that in other states, there are qualifications for other jobs.
Yep.
Kansas has some has a long list of qualifications in order to run for the school board, down to what degree you have to have in order to qualify. But there are many states that don't go that far.
Yep. Thanks, Gail. Chris Babbage, I got you next.
Yeah, thanks. On that issue of just discussion.
Your mic. Sorry.
Thank
Yeah.
you. On what we're just discussing, I think that ineligibility for the office kind of covers that. But I wanted to actually go back to number 1, if that's possible. Without us skipping ahead to number 2.
Okay.
I mean, it says vacancy may occur. By the way, our current language is, regarding forfeiture. I think we have may down below as well, but it is shall forfeit. Again, if it's cut and dry. But under number 1, death, I think that's straightforward. Resignation, that's a voluntary action, so that makes sense. Permanent mental or physical disability, I have a problem with that. First of all, is it ADA compliant? And it seems to me that that would be a justification for a person to resign. But if they choose not to, if somebody becomes blind in one eye, does that mean that the board has the option to vote that they must forfeit their position? I mean, I just see that as problematic.
Yeah.
And also who makes the determination and how, so.
It's fair. The town medical officer.
Yeah.
Boom. No, town medical officer.
Yeah.
Oh,
Some towns, it's a town manager.
All right.
At one time in this town, it was the assistant fire chief.
Aha.
Yes.
All right. Point well taken, I think, with a permanent mental or physical disability, and that makes sense, I think.
No reflection on the authors of the template, because permanent disability is part of our current charter.
Yeah. All right. Good point on point 1. Did anyone want to revisit and put in answer about properly qualified person as per Maine state law, as Durwood suggested? That was I like that, but I'm certainly one of 9 here, so.
I'm good with it.
All right. Yep, Barbara, go ahead.
Barbara Fleshman, Kennybunk. I was going to go back to what you said, Merton, in that somebody can be elected that's not qualified. So in order to run for the select board, all you need is like 25 signatures? Is that it?
25
Okay,
valid.
well, then does somebody look at everyone who is putting in their 25 names? Does anybody review the person who's putting their names in as a candidate? Does anybody review that person before the election comes out to decide whether he's qualified or not?
The only thing I would check on would be residency, and I would probably let them know that, but that issue's really never really sort of come up. I mean, I usually try to have the discussion with them indicating that they can run for all those offices if they choose, but they're really only going to qualify for one of them, and then give them consequences, because
So anyone can run, and then, so someone wins, and then the town has 10 days to decide whether they're qualified?
Correct, right, Natalie?
Is that it?
I mean, the qualification is civic interest.
No,
No.
there's qualifications.
Yeah.
Like, you have to be a resident, you have to be a certain age, you have to, you know.
But that's exactly what we were discussing. If there are state parameters, we should have those.
Right.
But talking about qualifications that are not state mandated, is that the word? That's where we're getting into
Somebody's gonna have,
loosey-goosey definitions.
should the qualifications be like residency or whatever, should those be defined in the charter?
Go ahead, Brenda, sure.
Qualifications mean something to all of us. What about eligibility criteria? Or something,
So that might fall in a different section
Yeah,
of the
it
charter, I believe, for eligibility to run. But I agree, I think if I sense what we're getting wrapped around the spoke about is a little bit around the process of this, is that someone could go through the whole process, win an election, and then be going to get installed and be like, oh, you're not qualified because you're 14 and you got elected, and
but it's
Here
the
we
word,
are.
it's the word qualify that I
Yeah.
think,
yeah.
and if you insert another word that reflects eligibility criteria, the right age, the right residency, things like that. And I'm not saying you have to use those words, but words that mean what we're defining.
Is it statistical? That's not the word.
Eligibility to run for an office is that you must be X number of years old, resident,
Other things, a human being, yeah,
but do you have to be a U.S. citizen?
Yes.
yes.
Okay, that's what, I think
Yep.
that's what this is
And
getting
that's why
at.
we want to
Yeah.
just point, in my opinion, and say, like as Durwood said, in section XYZ of Maine State Statute. Go ahead, Janice.
Yeah, I think this is hard for everybody because we've taken a chapter that's kind of down in the order of where this eventual charter will be, because Stephen and I kind of talked about, we had both envisioned that this would fit into a larger framework of boards, commissions, and committees, where this would come partly down, and the beginning part would have all that eligibility stuff, conflict of interest stuff, all the stuff that's contained today that's kind of scattered. We wanted to kind of reorganize and explain the difference between elected and appointed officials and what, their responsibilities may be and the process involved with them. So I feel bad because we're sort of, I think now we could take this and it's basically as specified under article blah, 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 once we have the whole thing organized.
Right.
And handle in definitions. And Susan, by the way, is our definitions person. So when anybody has a definition, shoot it to Susan. She's got our master list going.
Yeah, I think that we are kind of going down the rabbit hole of another section here with eligibility. So we've got Chris and Brenda, or Barbara, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to just carry on, but were you, is that all set? Or, okay. Go ahead, Chris.
I was just going to suggest that the sentence could be something along the lines of failure to meet eligibility to serve by meeting citizenship, age, residency, and oath requirements.
If that's all there is, yeah.
If I could just jump
Go
in
ahead,
on what
Natalie.
the state statute says, but then I'm going
Thank
to
you.
throw a little monkey wrench into it. Title 30A, Section 2526 talks about qualifications for holding municipal office. And it says a person must be a resident of the state, at least 18 years of age, and a citizen of the United States. And it also says in order to hold office as a member of a select board, a person must be a voter in the town in which the person is elected. But the very introductory language of that says, unless otherwise provided by charter.
Oh.
So there we go.
So I'm going to try to cap off the eligibility discussion, and we'll kind of back burner it until we get to that part of the charter. I think it'll be a rousing discussion, like trying to eat an artichoke. So properly qualified person in accordance with Maine statute or something along those lines.
Natalie, could you say what that was again?
38.
Did you want the statutory citation or the specific items?
The citation.
It's Title 30-A, section 2526, and it's subsection 3.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Do we have any other comments on vacancies and filling vacancies section? Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. We're talking about elected officials and appointed officials as well in the
Correct.
same section. So, ceasing to have one's legal domicile within the town. So somebody who's splitting time between here and Florida that serves on some remote committee that gets a difficult recruitment problem. I'm just trying to think of, are we putting roadblocks where there may not need to be? But obviously, we need legal doms, or we need official residency of the town to be in there.
Yeah.
But I was thinking that I don't know if committees and select board should have the same threshold of requirement, but that's all. One does toss that out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I'll tell you what happens in real life, on committees that that have open seats and might have a member who only attends one meeting a year. It's totally up to the chair to enforce whether or not they're meeting the attendance requirements and they lose their seat or not. And that happens as it is right now. So I think you would still find that to be the case with ceasing to have one's legal domicile within the town. If the committee chair or person of the public voices their concern, then they'll point here and say, you got to be off because that's what it says in the charter. But if no one ever brings it up or no one cares, that person will continue to serve, I bet. Go ahead, Ted.
Isn't there a definition of legal residence in Maine as 6 months plus a day, whatever it is?
Well, for voting purposes, you can only be voting in one state and one town in each state. So when somebody who is a snowbird and wishes to do Florida because their tax advantages, but they also have a domicile and they've established a domicile in Kennebunk, I say to them, I'm not telling you that you cannot register to vote in Maine, but you can't have a Maine and Florida voting residence. So you've got to choose one or the other.
Go ahead,
So
Stephen.
the 6 months,
sorry.
1 day is a tax thing more.
Correct.
Go ahead, Stephen. And then Chris.
May I ask you to explain that again, Merit? What does that actually mean as far as behavior?
It just means that they have to make the decision if they're Florida residents or Maine residents. They can make that decision if they have a domicile in each of those two states, but they have to decide one or the other. They cannot have, two voting places. So it's not a question of the registrar of voters saying you can't register in Maine. It's more of you've got to choose which state you wish to be a resident of. And a lot of people, when they hear that, they want to keep the Florida because it does have tax advantages over Maine.
Go ahead, Stephen.
I defer to Natalie on this, but there's a legal difference between your residence and your domicile. Domicile is where you have your principal residence and where you intend to return after an absence of however long. So you can only have one legal domicile, but you may have multiple residences. And that's why we put that in there. But hearing Chris's point again, I wonder if we need to address a situation where you have an appointed official who lives in Arundel, for example. He wouldn't be able to, and that's his domicile. He would be disqualified from holding office if we were to keep this language as it's currently drafted, which would not be in the best interests of the town.
I'm going to throw a fly in the ointment that's just occurring to me as I'm bouncing between these sections and say, why do we have two separate sections about vacancies and filling vacancies? And this is a question, and I'm sure maybe anyone's already thought of it and can point me to it, but I don't understand why there are two sections between vacancies and filling vacancies and forfeiture of office. Because I looked at number 4 there and said, well, number 4 is probably a reason to forfeit the office, because I was looking down at my other reference of number 2 under forfeiture of office with regard to committees and saying, well, I think those two things are basically reasons to forfeit your position, whether it's on elected or committee or commission. And then it got me to thinking, back to Chris's point at the beginning about saying shall instead of may, and that the forfeiture of office says shall. And I see both of these sections as just being a big list of these are the reasons you shouldn't be in your position anymore. And then the paragraph in the first section, when a vacancy in appointed office, is the process for how to appoint after a vacancy occurs. And it kind of makes me say, why isn't this just one list of reasons to forfeit the office and then finish with the process, which occurs duplicatively, described differently in both sections? So that was a really long-winded question of saying, please someone tell me, why is there a section about vacancies and filling vacancies, and why is there a section about forfeiture?
Because we carried it over from the old charter.
That's what I was anticipating, so.
Well, I mean, I would say that I respect the question, but I think that they're fundamentally different.
Okay.
And I think that when somebody quits, you need to not necessarily have a hearing on it and all the due process and everything. They've resigned, they've died.
Okay.
And so
Okay.
those automatic things. And so I think it's common to have these things that can be almost done by administrative action, just,
Okay.
noting that someone's passed, we send our condolences, we're going to fill the vacancy.
Okay. Go ahead, Stephen, and then Chris.
I totally agree with that. And also, I don't think that these sections should have shall language in there. Otherwise, you get an automatic, you're out if you violate one of these things. By putting permissive language in there, you give the select board the power to say, well, yeah, I mean, this is what theoretically you're subject to forfeiture, but under the specific circumstances of this particular case, we don't think that would be in the best interest of the town. Then leave the decision up to them, the select board, that is.
Go ahead, Chris.
The current language in the charter does have it under one section. It's section 1. It's subparagraph 1, subparagraph 2.
Yeah.
Under it, vacancies and forfeiture. But it's one section. I thought that was concise, but I don't think there's a lot of, well, we are kind of mulling through it, but I don't have much concern about the meaning of what we're trying to do here. But whereas forfeiture should be cut and dry as opposed to the recall. Recall is more of a process question because the reasoning behind a recall ultimately has to be a judgment of the voters, by the voters. Whereas forfeiture, we should be able to define very succinctly what it is that would cause this to happen.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping we can keep this short, this particular
Ted.
section. Easy to understand.
Yeah, this originally came up because in looking at the recall, we're saying, well, there's some obvious cases that should be, so we'll make that a forfeiture thing. And so the implication was that forfeiture is crystal clear. It gets into the opening this up for flexibility, starts to get into the legal vis-a-vis political issues, and which we've been trying to deal with by saying, okay, there's something absolutely clear. If this is clearly wrong legally, boom, they're forfeited. And then let's put all the rest of it under recall, which is more political. That's the way I was looking at it. And so it is a shall, to me. It should be really clear. And then all the other part, where someone should be removed from office for whatever reason, that's under, isn't necessarily recall, but as we get into the process question of how do you get someone, how do you force someone to forfeit the office, and how do you have a recall to remove them? That's a real deep process. How is that done? And we probably need to get into that one, too.
Gail?
Gail Spofford. I see the recall process and the forfeiture process as two separate. The recall is initiated by the citizens, by petition. Forfeiture is something that would be the domain of a governing body, and because it would affect them directly. And I would like to add that I think the language you have in here and the language that's been presented at the state level with regard to recall does a great deal to pull the politics out, because it's no longer a he said, she said. It's going to be based on something, a fact that can be vetted. And then one other thing, the number one under forfeiture of office, failure to be sworn in to the office by the town clerk within 30 days of that person's election or appointment. I'm happy to tell you that the towns will be receiving, if they haven't already received them now, a hold the date card for the celebration of the swearing in of all school board members at the last school board meeting of June, the 26th, at, I think it's at 5:15. And that is because the language for the oath of office in the recall, in the RSU section of Title 20A, the education section of legislation, has a totally different oath of office from the municipal oath of office. And so to make sure that all new board members take the same oath of office, we're having the celebration swearing in. And we had actually, because Shelley's a notary, we had asked her, and we didn't want to ask the town clerks to come if they were busy or have all three of them there at once, but you are invited to come.
Gail? Well,
So I just want to say that that sentence doesn't work for the school district. So you may want to consider that that only applies to municipal elected officials.
Thanks.
There are others that can swear in too. Dedimus Justice can, a notary can, at a town meeting, a moderator can. So maybe
Might
it should
wanna
just say
change town clerk.
sworn in.
Yeah.
A question for Gail again. Gail, is that a new process, having them all sworn at once?
Yes, because we're trying to, based on what happened recently, we're trying to have a cohesive welcoming of new board members by the sitting board as part of the onboarding process. So we felt it would be easier to do that if we did it with a celebration just before the beginning of their terms. They'll get a few handouts, they'll get references to policy, they'll get their new email address, and as soon as we get to the 1st of July, they'll receive email that they otherwise wouldn't be able to receive before their board members.
Okay, so this language would cover no matter if you,
Yeah, if you would
use that or
remove the
did
word
something
town
different.
clerk and change it, because 20A does have in there dedimus justice or notary, or you could add that to town clerk, and then it would work for everybody.
yeah, I just want to make sure we have language that's easy, applies across the board, and that way if you change a procedure, it's not going to throw a monkey wrench in anything.
Right. No.
Yeah.
And I actually went to the school board to take my oath of office.
Okay, thank you.
Chris, Mike, your mic?
Shelley would give it, she's a notary.
I got you, Dick.
Yeah.
I got you, Dick. Yep, I see you waving your hand, Dick. Sorry, go ahead, Chris. And then, are you all set? Okay, Dick, then Natalie.
Yeah, I have a question on number 4 under forfeiture. Any intentional violation of the terms of this charter? Well, who's going to decide whether it's intentional or unintentional? It seems to me it just ought to say any violation of the terms of this charter.
Yep. Natalie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back and address number one, and perhaps the language could just be slightly revised to read failure to be sworn into office as required by state law within 30 days. And then that covers these other situations where someone, as Merton noted, could go to a dedimus justice as opposed to going to him to get sworn in. They just have to provide him with evidence they've been sworn in. And when you get to it, I had a question about the language about when an election happens, when there's a vacancy in office, because I think there's actually 3 different terms put in here, and I'm not sure which one applies.
Go for it.
Okay, so it says now if a vacancy, first it says that the select board shall appoint a properly qualified person to fill the vacancy, blah, blah, blah. And the duration of the appointment shall be for the unexpired term of the vacant office or position. So that says to me, if you're a select board member and you resign or you move out of office, you move out of town, the select board appoints somebody for the rest of your 3-year term. But then it says, if a vacancy in an elected office has occurred, the position shall be filled at the next special or regular election. I don't know, I don't know that it was intended that the select board would be able to fill something for up to 2.5 years, as opposed to filling it until the next, and usually it's the next regular municipal election, if that's what was, but I don't know what was intended, so I want to.
That's what I was alluding to with
Okay,
regard
you have
to
the
appointed
vacancy in
versus
appointed office
elected.
has occurred for any reason. For the unexpired term of the vacant office, well, they do that anyway. If a vacancy, okay, thank you, Steve.
Okay.
Sorry.
So one, okay, gotcha. So, well, that was confusing to me too. Yep. So the first one's for appointed, the following sentence is for elected. Yep. No, I think it's right. I
Yes,
think there was
correct.
just confusion. Yep. Yeah, any other comments about vacancies before we move on to forfeiture?
Although I would note that for the vacancy in an elected office, as I noted, the position would normally be filled at the next regular municipal election, not a special election or.
All right. Moving on, forfeiture of office. I'll kick it off, and I'll just say I think I really appreciate the list. I think 1 through 9 is very good, and my only comment was around point number 8, which I think is a very valid, description to have there. But I would lead into it by just starting with any public statement, as opposed to saying engaging in hate speech on any variety of social or other media. I would just say, if anyone makes a public statement and then, in parentheses or whatever, say, including but not limited to social media, et cetera, so that it can, a little bit more concise, just being, social media is a public forum, it's a public statement, so it's probably more of, anyway, that's my only comment about those. So, but I thought the list was very good, very complete. Yeah, go ahead,
I
Steve.
think that's an excellent suggestion. I mean, any public statement that falls into that category is not appropriate for someone holding appointed or elected office, and they should be held accountable for that.
Yep. Susan.
Number 5, I had a note, I think this was left over from another draft, for Stephen and Janice, or Stephen and Durwood, failure to disclose conflict of interest. Does that include concealment of financial interest?
I would.
Under state law, a conflict of interest is defined as having a certain financial interest in something. It's a 10% ownership interest or a 10% share in a company that is involved in it. And so it is a defined term under state law.
Oh, okay, great, thank you. And then number 6, failure to follow the code of ethics. Does each board, commission, or committee have a code of ethics? I looked up the committee handbook, that has a standards of conduct section. So I didn't know the code of ethics.
The select board has a code of ethics, but I'm not, it's right there on the wall.
Yep.
I'm not sure any of the committees do. I mean, they may have some bylaws, but certainly not.
Right,
code.
that was sort of a rhetorical question, because I thought not. So failure to follow the code of ethics set out in the charter. Are we going to have a code of ethics set out in the charter? If those other entities do not have their own code of ethics, that's a question. I, too, wanted to commend you on this list. I thought it was a terrific thing. And again, I had brought this up before. It's not our problem, but once this is adopted, once this is adopted, again, the committee handbook and anything else, any other applicable document, are those going to be updated to reflect this language? And particularly 8, I thought, that was so well worded. I think, note to whomever, I think at some point when we finish the charter, a lot of the language that we're agonizing over and massaging could very well be adopted into other town documents for consistency, because some of it is wonderful. And then my last comment on the second page, the long paragraph, if an elected or appointed official is alleged to have engaged, sort of in the middle, the sentence that begins on the margin, committee shall refer the matter to the select board, which shall schedule a hearing. Is that a public hearing? And if so, should that be added? It's a public hearing?
Yeah, schedule a hearing versus schedule a public hearing.
Is there a difference between a hearing and a public hearing?
Go ahead.
The intention was that it was going to be a public hearing.
There would be a difference, because in theory, some of these things could be handled as personnel matters under the executive session law. And so if you want them to be public hearings, I think you should state that.
Do we want it to be a public hearing? I would imagine.
Opinion?
It's sort of in the middle of the paragraph.
The
it's so long.
commission committee shall refer to the matter to the select board, which shall schedule a hearing to determine whether the elected or appointed official's office is forfeit.
It's the 7th sentence down.
How do you guys want to go with that? I mean, we talked 2 things with this in the past about how nice it would be to force somebody accused of an action to stand up in public and have to defend himself. And versus the fact that, there needs to be a mechanism for that person to be able to discuss it with the board he sits on. So what do you guys think works best?
To complicate matters, what if we made the language so that it was the accused choice to be public or private? Because I think, and the only experience I have is with the recent recall, and I'm not saying it would have changed anything, but I think the fact that the language provided it as a public hearing was a deterrent, because it didn't want to have it be a public circus, or, go ahead, Chris.
I probably wouldn't mind that for an appointed position, but if you're going to reverse a vote of the people,
True.
the people should understand the reasons for that.
Yep.
And so that's why I think that has to be
A public.
a public hearing.
Yep.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, well, first of all, let me ask about number 2, failure to attend 3 or more consecutive. 3 or more consecutive is pretty universal through the charters that I've looked at. Some of them have the 25% or more meetings held during a 6-month period.
We have that here, too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I guess, again, I'm looking at elected versus appointed. So you're saying to me, if a person only makes 9 out of 12 meetings in a year, that they should forfeit their position? That's,
No, it's.
well, I understand they can be
right.
excused, but.
Right.
I beg your pardon?
Yes, excused, some can be excused.
They can
yes.
be excused, but that requires that we have to get into the weeds. Just because they missed 3 out of 12 meetings. I mean, I don't know if we're micromanaging here when we start doing,
I
For
mean,
an appointed
that is
position.
the language from the charter today, like.
for the select board, I understand it. I'm not sure
No,
if I
but
do.
for committees as well,
Yeah.
appointed positions as well. Yeah.
Well, for planning board, we had a member for many years who would go south for the winter. And it just kind of got worked out. He got information while I was gone and kept up to date. And it never really affected, Ted can adhere to that, it never really affected anything. So, and it was just an agreement that everybody just made, and, there was nothing formal about it.
Yeah, okay, I just don't want this to be weaponized, I just. The other ones, again, 3 through 7, I haven't, 8 and 9 I've looked at, but I think everything here is awesome, but there is judgment involved in each one of those. And in these cases, I guess what we're doing is we're asking the select board to make that judgment. Is that right? But that is not as cut and dry as, as I had hoped would be with forfeiture, because we're asking the board to make a judgment if the voters' will should be overturned based on a select board judgment if these thresholds have been reached. Thanks.
And that's why we need to focus on the distinction between shall and may.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, in my opinion, I think laying out forfeiture of office as the intent was to make it like a black and white list, which I think is very clear, really alleviates a lot of the judicial responsibility coming onto the select board. Granted, maybe this process paragraph at the end is overkill because maybe it does give the select board a lot of leeway in saying, well, maybe yes, maybe no, sure, it was black and white, you missed this many meetings, but you gave us an excuse, and maybe, I'm not saying one way or the other, there shouldn't be this much leeway for public hearing and explain yourself and everything like that if we don't think that's the right way to go. I'm just throwing it out there. Go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, to get back to that point, the original idea of having this separate section would be, okay, this is the clear-cut cases, put it over there and not worry about it.
Yeah.
And then let's get down to the one that involve political processes and things like that. So to the extent that we can, the artichoke leaves keep piling up. But the, I have two comments on 1 through 8, 9. One is the one that Dick Smith made, intentional. That's clearly a lot of mushiness in that one and hard to prove. And so take that out. The second one is in number 6, failure to follow the code of ethics set out in the charter. That means we have to have a code of ethics in the charter. We do? That's
Sorry, there is something, but that stuff's kind of sprinkled all over. And that's what we wanted to do. We kind of had this idea of having a whole framework of boards, commissions, and committees, and have all that stuff in there. Because it only applies to that, committee structure. It doesn't apply to things like an election or, some of the other little tiny sections that we thought can just kind of stay. We want to have the whole framework laid out so that everybody knows how this is affected. And so then again, Ted, it is kind of like we're jumping on the horse midway through the ride here. All that stuff would be earlier in the document. So yeah, there would be
Okay, so to clarify, there's code of ethics for a elected body, there's a code of ethics for committee, the code of ethics would be probably have some different languages depending on whose it was for. And so I would suggest that we clarify that and say, okay, follow the code of ethics set out in the charter for elected officials or something, just as definition so that we don't get into, what about a code of ethics for the dog committee?
To avoid us going down a rabbit hole, that I do think there is very much a need because of that document up on the wall and trials and tribulations associated with it over the past few years, for us to standardize a code of ethics for, in my opinion, elected, appointed officials that is standard in the charter. And really, if anyone ever tries to say, hey, we're the dog walking committee and we're going to define our own code of ethics, put some wording in there that says, hey, no thanks, you're going to follow the standard code of ethics. I saw Miriam's got a hand up, Susan, Brenda. Go ahead, Miriam.
Thank you. I would just encourage you to try to make this as black and white as possible because select boards come and go, and they certainly can be political, and you want to make this as clear as you possibly can so that it's not subject to interpretation by a board.
Thanks, Miriam. Susan.
I just want to make sure for what we have at the moment, I guess, in the current charter is section 3.12, conflicts of interest, semicolon, ethical standards. Is that what we're considering to be the code of ethics at the moment?
Well, I guess there is no moment. This is what's in place today. And I think
what's in place today is the past charter. Is the current charter, excuse me, not what we're working on now.
So we're going to need to talk about this, Susan, yeah. We're going to need to look at what we have today and look at the other towns have and plagiarize and whatever we want. And if we can make this better, let's do it. And we can send chocolates to whatever town we steal their stuff from. I don't know,
Yeah, okay, but that's what the section 3.12 is the closest thing that we
Yeah, ethical standards, code of ethics.
And so whoever draws the short straw will get to do that one.
Any volunteers, code of ethics?
I would be happy to do that.
All right, we got volunteers already. Go, Brenda, you're up next.
I think I have 4 things on my list. But let me start with
Yeah, your mic before you go too far.
I think I have 4 things on my list, but I'll start with the code of ethics because that's our topic. I've been on site plan review board for 17 years. No one has ever mentioned a code of ethics to us in any fashion, even though there is a code of ethics there. I think somehow that needs to be considered, and I don't think I need to say any more than that, but
Yep.
it needs to be done, and it needs to be consistent because there is a code of ethics for committees. Let me go back to Section 1, Number 2, because we haven't addressed this. No, I'm sorry. Where's the one about state? No, forfeiture of office. Number 1, failure to be sworn into office as required by state law. Is it only, that's the state law. There was another one. Oh, I've got too much on my mind. Go back to Section 1, removal from office in any manner provided by law. And Stephen and Janice have put in here, which law covers this?
Yeah.
So number 3
Number 3.
in the first section.
Provided by state and federal law? I mean, what do you, they asked which law, and we haven't,
Yeah.
and Natalie's shaking her head, and maybe it's, I'm just raising the question, because they asked and we didn't discuss.
And right now, I think the only other removal from office provided by law is recall. But as was noted, this is in other towns, and I would suggest, for the reason you just stated, that you have this, but perhaps have it at the end, removal from office in any other manner provided by law, in case statutes change and there's some other reason. Now, in theory, they would apply anyway, but if it says pursuant to your charter, you may want to just have that ability to have anything that's added on.
So we should keep that, Natalie, and maybe just say state law?
I would leave it in. It is, and I recognize that really there's only a few things, and you've probably got them all set forth here anyway, but what if there were something else added to state law?
Okay,
You
we'll do
might
that then,
want
thank
that
you.
incorporated.
Well, the reason I asked that is that I did a little research on forfeiture. And it mentions some of the federal laws that obviously pertain to us, but they are not main laws, such as the racketeer law, the Comprehensive Crime Control Act. These come from online, from legal sources. Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. Some of these go back 1970, but that's why I mentioned, is it just state law or state and federal law? Or is it any law? I mean, it's not, certainly not international law, but, or maybe it is. Give it a shot.
Ogunquit provides for potential removal from office for the violation of any law of any nation,
That's,
which is, anyway.
well,
I would suggest that we simply put removal from office in any other manner provided by law and stick that as the cleanup provision, the last article or the last subsection of this article.
that covers it all. Okay. Forfeiture of office, number 2, failure to attend 3 or more consecutive, that's not the issue. Does the remote attendance policy have any impact on this?
Only to, like, cover it, I think, and let me explain that, is that I think, as Dick's doing tonight, Dick is in attendance according to the remote policy
Right.
meeting, so he is not absent tonight. So
Okay.
I think having the remote policy in place makes it so that Dick is in attendance tonight.
So I just wrote it down as a question,
Gotcha.
so I can scratch that one. And I think that's all I had here. Let me yield
All right.
the microphone.
Yield the floor. Any others on forfeiture of office? We've got about 14 minutes before I'm going to be looking for a motion. We've gotten through 1/3 of the agenda. So, go us. Yeah, we're getting there. We're getting there. I mean, we're unpacking a lot of things, right? We're finding a lot of rabbit holes to dive down that are going to be hopefully easier future conversations because we've started that conversation tonight. Chris, I saw your hand up, so.
I just, So I guess the questions I had regarding forfeiture, when we talk about neglect of duty having significant adverse effect, you know, what is the measure of that? It's just less defined than I would like to have under forfeiture. But violation of terms of charter, I think we cleaned that up a little bit. Failure to disclose a conflict of interest. You know, I think intentional concealment versus somebody being, I mean, I would think it would be harsh to point out to somebody that there's a conflict of interest and then vote for forfeiture without them having an opportunity to rectify the situation if two people were, for instance, employed or whatever. When it's a failure to follow the code of ethics, maybe that's clear cut, but somebody will have to determine that. And then when we talk about misconduct involving dishonesty, I guess fraud, is that how we would cover the Santos example? But I will say, you know, obviously the Santos situation has come to where there is criminal prosecution. But if there had been none, or if there is none in a case where we have these things, then the question becomes proven, confessed, or adjudicated. You know, I'm just saying the determination of wrongdoing is not as cut and dry as I would like it to be. And therefore, I suppose, if the school board, we're empowering the school board to take action. If the school board does not take action, these are the things that I see as being legitimate recall provisions, because they are not necessarily merely the discretionary behavior in fulfilling a person's role, such as on a school board or a select board or whatever. In other words, it can't be political. We're talking about wrongdoing. You know,
Right.
Yeah. So that's the discomfort that I'm sharing. That's all. I thought we might try to stick to criminal and eligibility issues for forfeiture, but I appreciate the work because these things need to be addressed. I would rather not be in forfeiture and be in recall, or again, maybe have the select board initiate a recall, since there's judgment involved, rather than a citizen-initiated recall. But
Go ahead, Stephen.
We were mindful of that, actually, in section 702C of the present draft, B of the present draft for recall. One of the grounds specifically provided is deliberate misrepresentation by an elected official of his/her qualifications, background, or work history before or after the election in which he/she was elected. And that is absolutely a judgment for the electors to make, and perhaps should make. And in Santos's case, I would hope certainly would or will make.
Thanks, Stephen. Go ahead, Brenda.
Just on that topic, I see a very clear distinction between recall, which is the voice of the people, and forfeiture, which is office committee, et cetera. I think this statement is very important, and we've had a lot of turnover here in the town hall. But I remember being on a committee that will remain nameless, and having a member of that committee take some money. Things were pretty loose. And money was given and then denied. And the person denied that the money was received, and it was very easy to prove that. So I just want to comment on having experience with that one. It wasn't pleasant.
Noted. Should we use 9 minutes to briefly move on to 702, or should we make a motion?
Do the minutes?
Do the minutes. All right. Do the minutes. All right, so we got a third of the way through, and the only comment I was gonna make about 702, Stephen pre-countered for me, so, well done. Consideration approval of minutes. I make a motion to approve the minutes from the Wednesday, April 26th, meeting 2023. Do I have a second?
Second.
Seconded by Susan. Open discussion. Any comments?
I would just say that the minutes are extremely thorough. I mean, it's just
Hats off
not,
as
not
always
used to seeing
to,
them that thorough. but-
Absolutely, absolutely.
hats off as always to Janice.
Yeah,
our-
you can actually learn something by reading the minutes, and that's what's wonderful.
It's true.
Christian, you have to do a roll call because we have somebody remote.
Oh, okay. Okay. Roll call vote. Thank you, Merton. Dick, I'll start with you. How do you vote?
Recuse myself because I wasn't there.
Good job. Ted? Chris Babbage?
Yes.
Janice Vance? Brenda Robinson?
Yes.
Darwood Parkinson? Susan Bloomfield?
Yes.
Stephen Sayers?
Yes.
And I vote yes. So it was 8-0, 1 abstain. And it was called by myself and Susan, seconded. All right. Do I have a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
Can I
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I just want to add something?
Jump.
I would like to add to the, an action item. I would be happy to be a volunteer for the Code of Ethics section.
Okay.
I'm going to throw that in there
Good stuff.
so I can't get out of it.
I already heard that Brenda and Susan would like to volunteer for that, so I have no reason. Medical degree.
I'm highly ethical.
All right. Should we make the motion again? I think I heard a motion to adjourn from Brenda. Do I have a second? Second by Janice Vance. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And I guess, do we have to do a roll call? Yeah. All right. Got to go around again. Dick Smith, how do you vote?
Aye.
Ted Trainer. Chris Babbage.
Yes.
Janice Vance. Brenda Robinson.
Yes.
Darwood Parkinson.
Aye.
Susan Bloomfield. Steve Sayers.
Yes.
And I vote yes. 9-0-0. Meeting adjourned.
Sausage making process is